is Stephen Mock, and as a former chair of the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism and member of the Nations and Nationalism Board, I have been given the privilege of welcoming you all in here and online to the 2023 Ernest Gellner Lecture. Before I introduce our speaker, Andrew Wilson, I'd like to say a few words about the Gellner Lecture. Ernest Gellner began his academic career at Balliol College, Oxford, as a philosopher. His first book, Words and Things, being a trenchant attack on ordinary language philosophy, or as he called it, linguistic philosophy. He would later turn to the philosophy of history and social anthropology, and his fusion of these studies come together for his work on nations and nationalism, for which he is best known here. He generated what I would stake is still, for all the debate that it has engendered, the only comprehensive, systematic, general theory on the formation of nations and nationalism in the modern world. He quite literally wrote the book on nations and nationalism. By way of University of Edinburgh, Gellner came to the London School of Economics, establishing it for some decades as a center for the study of nationalism, where ASEN and associated journals would eventually form. It is Gellner's presence there that leads to most books on nationalism theory having a chapter on what is often termed in shorthand the LSE debate. His work was informed throughout by his early life experiences, the contestations over identity during times of crisis that he witnessed growing up in Prague, experiencing the rise of Nazism and the Second World War, and the rise of communism. This made him, in the words of Paul Stirling, a one-man crusader for critical rationalism. Yet his capacity for criticism extended to self-reflection as well, for he himself said, "I do not think I could have written the book on nationalism which I did write, were I not capable of crying with the help of a little alcohol over folk songs which happen to be my favorite form of music." After his passing, the Ernest Gellner Lecture was established by ASEN in his memory, and traditionally takes place on the eve of the association's annual conference. It now alternates with a lecture in memory of the other great LSE scholar of all things nationalism, Anthony D. Smith. This evening's Gellner lecturer is Andrew Wilson, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and professor in Ukrainian studies at University College London. His monographs include Ukraine Crisis, What the West Needs to Know, Belarus, The Last European Dictatorship, and Virtual Politics, Faking Democracy in the Post-Soviet World. His articles have appeared in Party Politics, the Journal of Contemporary History, and of course, Nations and Nationalism. He has also written for The Guardian, The Mirror, La Vanguardia, and El País. His expertise covers the post-Soviet space, particularly those states' democratization or otherwise, and he focuses, of course, on Ukraine. A constant recurring theme in the study of nations and nationalism is how often our field seems to be consigned strictly to history, with nationalism viewed in the popular and even scholarly imagination as an ideology that had its day but has since been transcended. The collapse of the Soviet Union was one such instance that sparked a rigorous debate on the unexpected resurgence of nations and nationalism, but was soon itself viewed as a moment in time that had passed. Yet again, recent events have intervened to demonstrate that we have still not reached the end of history. It is appropriate then that this evening's lecture is on Ukraine, and while ASEN remains committed to its academic standards, I feel I should reiterate the statement that ASEN made just last year. As a scholarly organization that has members in both Ukraine and Russia, which has published on Russia and Ukraine in our journals and organized events on both countries, the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism deplores the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. The invasion is a grave violation of international law and an attack on a sovereign democratic state. We particularly condemn the denial of the existence of the Ukrainian nation implicit in Vladimir Putin's statements. We hope that peace can quickly be restored. Our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine, and particularly our members and and other fellow academics. The title of this evening's Gellner lecture is Ukraine at War, Baseline, Identity, and Social Construction. So without any further delay, Professor Andrew Wilson.
Thank you, Stephen. Pleasure to be here. My talk makes two arguments. First, Ukrainians' resilience in the face of Russia's 2022 invasion can be explained by cumulative identity change through successive revolutions. The Orange Revolution in 2004, the Revolution of Dignity in 2013-14, and what the Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Gritsak has called the Ukrainian Patriotic War today. Therefore, the baseline of Ukrainian identity was very different on the eve of the war to what it was just after independence in 1991. Secondly, the two phases of the war in 2014 and 2022 have accelerated both the civic and the social construction of Ukrainian identity. Ukraine is now a consolidated civic and political nation, defined by opposition to Russia's aggressive re-imperialization and autocratic political culture, and by its Ukrainian antonyms, the idea of freedom, of state versus empire, and of what might be called hyper-Europeanization. Thirdly, in this talk, I will review some of the key literature on Ukraine, particularly on issues of Ukrainian national identity, since 1991. The better academic judgments were pretty accurate, I would argue. The popular stereotype of a divided Ukraine was not. I will talk for about 35, 40 minutes before turning to the actual PowerPoint rather than going back and forth, which has the key data in it. That will come at the end of the talk. So to begin, Ukraine is a great testing ground for theories of nationalism. According to scholars like Sergei Borchy, Frank Sisson, Zenon Kohut, it was an exemplar of Adrian Hastings' 1997 book, religion-based pre-modern construction of nationhood. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the local Orthodox Church was heavily influenced by the Renaissance, Reformation, and Counter-Reformation, at a time when the Russian Church resisted all such influence or change. Along with the Uniate Church established in 1596, the Ukrainian Orthodox culture provided a way of being in between Roman Catholic Poland and Orthodox Russia of the doctrine of the Third Rome. Moreover, associated Cossack culture provided key mythomoteurs for an early modern nation: liberty, government by contract, and horizontal self-organisation. Ukrainian, or Ruthenian, to use the terminology of the time, Cossacks were differentiated from Russian Cossacks as they were escapees from largely Polish state authority, rather than guarding and expanding the frontiers of the state, as in Russia. The leitmotif of freedom also came from first protecting the local population, not against Russia, but against Crimean Tatars, and then, ironically, sharing their fate, to be absorbed by the Russian Empire at the same time in the late 18th century. I won't read out all the footnotes, but here I've written Rory Finnan, Blood of Others, an excellent book that came out last year on Crimean Tatar culture. And this mythology is resonant today, even though Ukrainian history is admittedly discontinuous, even though this early modern nation was deconstructed in the 18th century by its absorption into various empires, mainly the Romanov-Russian Empire. But precisely because it was this early modern construct made out of ideas around religion and the social phenomenon of Cossackdom, it is easily recoverable today, and its ideas are particularly resonant at a time of war. The word freedom and its cognates appear 4 times in the national anthem. References to ruling our own land 5 times, and the need to fight for that 3 times. This is an anthem that was written long before the current war. Crimean Tartar anthem, if anybody is interested, is similar. The memory of these lost Cossack rights, as in the story by Gellner, The Lost Contract, was the basis of the 19th century national movement. Though, as historian Ivan Rudnitsky wrote in 1963, the modern Ukrainian nation is not simply a continuation or restoration of the Cossack Ukraine of the 17th and 18th centuries. It was indeed a preeminent product of modernisation processes from the late 19th century onwards. The story told by Ernest Gellner. In fact, Ernest Gellner was thinking of Lviv, the West Ukrainian capital or private city, as his point of contact between Ruritanians and megalomanians. It took Eugene Weber's peasants, at the same time, 70 years to become Frenchmen, from 1870 to 1940. In Ukraine in the same period, the effects of modernisation on Ukrainian identity were limited, relatively late and complicated, and differentiated both geographically, with Ukrainians living in both Romanov and both halves of the Habsburg empires, and in terms of modernisation design and impact. Ukrainians in Habsburg Austria developed a stronger civil society compared to Ukrainians in Hungary or in the Romanov Empire. But Ukrainians everywhere were not that modernised. They were disproportionately rural, relatively poor, and with limited education. The Habsburg Empire had more impact on its subject, but that impact was still relatively limited. Ideas, therefore, were relatively important, but the means of disseminating them were limited. The various attempts to build a Ukrainian state in 1917 to 21 were therefore as much cause as effect of burgeoning national consciousness. Though the mythology of our revolution, a term invented at the time of the centenary in 2017, has been embraced to a much warmer extent than Russia has covered the same centenary. Russia under Putin didn't quite know how to relate to revolution, as it basically opposes the idea of revolution. But this idea of our revolution in Ukraine and the centenary of it has been retrospectively much celebrated. Although Ukraine was not really a nation in 1917 to 21. Modernisation and urbanisation under Soviet rule was again a complicated story. 18% lived in towns and cities in 1926, 67% in 1989. So if modernisation is urbanisation, it largely occurred under Soviet rule. Back in 1980, Bogdan Kravchenko wrote a book called Social Change and National Consciousness in 20th Century Ukraine. He argued that social change, basically urbanisation, had sharpened the national consciousness of Ukrainians in a classically Gellnerian manner as they moved into cities. A critic at the time, though, Alexander Motyl, answered that this mattered little. Ukrainians could not express their national identity because the political system didn't allow them to. Cusio and Wilson, 1994, gave a more nuanced answer. Some cities were indeed Ukrainianizing. Lviv, for example, had dramatically lost its traditional Polish and Jewish populations the Soviet atmosphere mattered. The title of a book by Tarek Cyril Amar in 2015 indicates that the paradoxes of Ukrainian Lviv, a borderland city between Stalinists, Nazis and nationalists. So even Lviv in the west was a kind of hybrid city, also somewhat Soviet. Cities in the centre of Ukraine were more hybrid, even linguistically. The phenomenon of Surzhyk, mixed language Ukrainian and Russian, was most prominent in those central cities. Others in the east and south were already Russian speaking, and movement into them had the opposite effect, acculturating people into an amalgam of Russian speaking Soviet culture. Moreover, the elites produced under Soviet rule in Soviet Ukraine were somewhat Ukrainian light. There was a political movement in the 60s, but it called itself a Rukh Opori, a movement of defence, a kind of defensive desire to prevent erosion of Ukrainian language and culture rather than anything more ambitious. Though ideologically, it transformed from the kind of nationalism of West Ukraine in the 1940s into a much more civic, general Ukrainian tradition because of three things. One, the military wing of Ukrainian nationalism had been defeated in the 40s and 50s, so the idea of winning independence through force of arms seemed utopian. Second, Soviet rule in the 60s seemed consolidated. But thirdly, the amalgamation of these various types of Gellnerite effect meant that pure Ukrainian nationalism, based narrowly on linguistic priority, was not going to sell in the more hybrid cities of the centre and the east and south. David Leighton, although talking about the post-war, post-independence period, beg your pardon, after 1991, emphasised the multi-layered effect of Soviet federalism and the importance of political tipping points in determining how these Gellnerite contacts between Ruritanians and Megalomanians actually played out. So our first baseline 1.0, is the type of Ukraine at independence in 1991. Despite the idea that the Chernobyl disaster in 1996 awakened Ukraine, only limited public politics was possible in Soviet-ruled Ukraine until proper democratization as late as 1990. In the elections held in Ukraine in that year, in March, the main opposition movement, which saw itself as national democratic but promoting Ukrainian culture and language, much like the generation of the 60s, was only able to win about a quarter of the seats. Unlike the Baltic states, Moldova and Georgia and Armenia, where decisive majorities backed independence. Popular mobilisation was a factor, as in the Baltic states, but numbers in Ukraine were smaller, and the purpose of popular mobilisation was to try and radicalise Rukh and to strengthen its hand with the communists. Unlike in the Baltic states, where the purpose of popular mobilisation was to demonstrate overwhelming rejection of Soviet rule and its legitimacy. So Wilson and Kuzia, 1994, quote leading dissident Levko Lukianenko in 1992, who said, quote, Independence only became possible because both nationalists, meaning Ruck, and communists agitated for independence. Nationalist movement wasn't strong enough to achieve that on its own. So independence was achieved by a fateful grand bargain in 1991. Ruck made common cause with former communists who got to keep their jobs if they backed independence. So under Ukraine's first two presidents, Leonid Kravchuk, 1991 to 94, and Leonid Kuchma, 94 to 2005, Ukraine remained post-Soviet. There was independence but no real social revolution. And for Ukrainian nationalism in the 1990s was what I call a minority faith in a book written in 1997. In the sense that its full package of precepts was only backed by this electoral 25%, which is basically historical Western regions and the capital, Kiev. Ruch survived until the 1998 parliamentary elections, largely because its cultural Ukrainianization agenda remained unfulfilled. It came second in that election with 9.7% of the vote. But ironically, the Communist Party came first. It was still around in 1998. So you had a minority faith of Ukraine. Ukrainian nationalism at that time could be classified as a minority faith. The rest of the country included a smaller minority of pro-Russian or Soviet nostalgia groups, with a large amorphous middle ground in between. So that should be emphasised. Pro-Russian nationalism in Ukraine was also a minority faith, and a much smaller one. A party that you probably never heard of, Russian Unity, for example, won 4% of the vote in the 2010 elections in Crimea. Its leader, Punchline, is now the Prime Minister of Crimea, having been installed by Russia. But 4% was what he could gather in a genuine popular vote. Different academics use different labels and concepts for the middle ground, the in-between, the post-Soviet amorphous Ukraine of that time. Paul Pirie, for example, 1996, National Identity in Politics in South and East Ukraine, talked eloquently about mixed identities. Valery Kamelko and others, who were only able, really, in surveys in the 90s, only able to gather ethnicity and language as data, put them together to posit Russian-speaking Ukrainians as a key middle ground. Others talked about regional identities. There was a very productive academic debate by Henry Hale, Lowell Barrington, and Gwendolyn Sasser and others about region as a factor in itself, over and above ethnicity or language in Ukrainian identity politics. The Ukrainian cultural critic Mikhail Repchuk talked about Creolism, post-colonial hangover affecting many Ukrainians who still spoke Russian but adopted many Russian cultural precepts. This debate about post-colonial Ukraine was therefore already active in the 1990s in the work of Stephen Velichenko, Marko Pavlishin, and others. This is our first baseline 1.0. Ukraine's initial post-Soviet period lasted 2 decades, until a transition period beginning with the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Maidan Revolution of 2013 to 14. This was a third decade of double refoundation and cumulative transformation. Helps to think of Ukraine as becoming independent in 1991, but basically refounded 3 times by these 2 domestic revolutions and by 2 wars with Russia. These were the Ukrainian equivalent of what others have called the impressionable years. Pyle, 2021, referenced in McGill, 2023. They're writing about the Gorbachev era and the poverty of the 1990s for Russians as impressionable years. Now, many Ukrainians were similarly impressed upon in the Gorbachev era in the 1990s. But for them, those years have been displaced as kind of central reference points by the domestic revolutions and wars with Russia. This is David Leighton's point about the importance of political choice and tipping points. In the Ukrainian case, 2 domestic revolutions and 2 wars with Russia gave meaning to the previously empty slogan of a civic nation. So I'll quote extensively from the official parliamentary resolution on the Maidan Revolution of 2014, which was passed in 2021 on the eve of Russian invasion. It says, one of the key moments of Ukrainian state formation and an expression of the national idea of freedom. This is how the demonstrations of 2013 and 2014 are characterised. Ukraine paid too high a price for freedom from dictatorship and to make its civilizational choice to be part of Europe. The heroes who died, who are called the Heavenly 100, the roughly 100 who were killed in the protests who ascended to heaven, gave their lives during the Revolution of Dignity, defending the ideals of democracy, defending human rights and freedoms, and the European future of Ukraine. The memory of their heroic act is part of the history of national statehood. So already in 2021 you see the consolidation of this civic and political idea of Ukraine as a nation of freedom fighters. Also important was that the Revolution of Dignity ended the golden era of political technology in Ukraine, bad politics, as well as the good politics of protest. Now, many of you may not be familiar with this term, political technology. There is a book coming out by me called Political Technology, 2023, Cambridge University Press, which seeks to argue that this basically Russian term, which we don't use in the West, is actually globalizing. A short definition of it would be the supply-side manipulation of politics for partisan advantage. Much more than mere spin or political consulting, it is the engineering of the political system itself. Perhaps in Q&A I'll explain more. The point here is that Ukrainian elections, all of them, from around 1998 to 2014, were distorted by political technology. First, Russians playing games of divide and rule within Ukraine, and then Americans. Some of you a Republican political consultant who moved back and forth between America and Ukraine. He took what in America was called the Southern Strategy, the strategy beginning in the Nixon era to persuade voters in the old US South to switch their allegiance from the Democratic to the Republican Party by making cultural appeals to them. Manafort took that to Ukraine in the form of a kind of Eastern strategy, persuading voters in the eastern southern Ukraine, again, to vote on cultural issues. Dotted lines of division in post-Soviet Ukraine were therefore inked in. So Ukraine had a whole series of elections where it looked to be fatally divided, split down the middle between west and centre, east and south. Particularly in the presidential elections 2004 to 2010, parliamentary elections in 2006, 7 and 12. But retrospectively, given that elections since then have not been at all like that, and elections before were also not like that, retrospectively this seems an artificial product of political technology rather than an essential part of the Ukrainian identity. Because when the Revolution of Dignity was over in 2014, it segued with Russian invasion. This was kind of the point of that invasion, to try and negate the impact of the Revolution of Dignity. But it failed because the decade of two revolutions, Orange in 2004 and Revolution of Dignity in 2013-14, had already shifted the baseline and undermined the kind of work of Manafort and others. So Ukraine had points of vulnerability when Russia started its first war in 2014, in Crimea and in the Donbass. But this was minority separatist sentiment, no more, which on the whole was well assessed by sociologists and political scientists. So Wilson and Smith, in 1997, rethinking Russia's post-Soviet diaspora, the potential for political mobilization in eastern Ukraine and northeast Estonia. This is an article I read with the late Graham Smith, 1997. So we used social mobilization theory and political opportunity structure theory to argue back then, 1997, in Ukraine at least, the potential for mobilization by Russian-speaking minorities against majority Ukrainian culture was limited. Firstly, because of identity. There is no such thing as a Russian community, a Russian-speaking community, or a Russian-oriented community in Ukraine. These are millions of people divided into separate sub-communities. Although Russia has constantly shifted along these categories, targeting millions. But it's targeted them in a particularly Russian way, again through political technology, thinking that a Russian world could be created by political technology, by government-organised NGOs, by propaganda messaging. In fact, the whole idea of a Russian world was first proposed by political technologist Pyotr Shchedrovitsky, founder of the methodology school of social engineering in Russia. So the idea of Russian world was itself a kind of political projection outwards into a community which didn't, a series of communities which didn't really understand it. Secondly, we emphasised in 1997 the importance of elites. Thirdly, political opportunity. Case study literature at the time, in the 90s and the noughties, for example, on the crisis in Crimea in 1994, put these two together, elites and political opportunities, to show that the crisis in Crimea in 1994 happened because Kiev was overconfident and allowed elections in Crimea that produced a separatist president and parliament. But that political opportunity to mobilise against Kiev was soon closed by elite agreement in 1995. Important because that didn't happen in 2014. A famous opinion poll showed that 41% of Crimeans supported the unification of Ukraine and Russia in a single state in February 2014, before annexation. Which isn't quite the same thing as what they got, Crimea joining Russia. 41%. A similar poll in the Donbass at the time asked, do you support the idea of your region succeeding from Ukraine and joining Russia? Support in the two regions of the Donbass, one is called Donetsk and other Luhansk. Definitively answering yes to that question was 12% in Donetsk and 13% in Luhansk. So this is our baseline 2.0 in 2014. So Ukraine is a somewhat more consolidated state with a problem of minority separatism, arguably at quite high levels for any state, but 40% in Crimea and 12 or 13% in the Donbass is not majority support for separatism. Russia achieved its aims in Crimea and the Donbass by using other things, by military intervention and by changing the political opportunity structure and by co-opting local elites, going back to the analytical structure in Smith and Wilson, 1997. Baseline 3.0. Since then, if our picture in 2014 was of a consolidating Ukraine which had some problems at its periphery, baseline 3.0, by the time of war in 2022, Ukraine was a more consolidated society. For two reasons: civic success and Zelensky, the current president. Firstly, civic. Andreas Gellner, in Nation Building, Why Some Countries Come Together While Others Fall Apart, argued for three mechanisms that bridge ethnic divides. I'll mention two. The first is the density of voluntary and civil society networks that, quote, knit together different regions into a quilt of political networks. The density of voluntary and civil society networks. A second is the state's capacity to provide public goods. Now, despite many disappointments, Ukraine improved dramatically on both these fronts, even before Zelensky was elected in 2019. What Ukrainians call skimming, which means big corruption schemes, were much reduced. The banking system, which was notoriously corrupt, was cleaned up. Ukraine's many state-owned enterprises began to work more for the consumer than for their owners. You could write an entire book on the Ukrainian railways, which doesn't sound like an interesting subject. But from one of the most corrupt industries in Eastern Europe and a massive black hole. The railways have kept the country alive in the last year because they are now extremely well run. Why didn't the then President Poroshenko win re-election, therefore, given that there were already considerable improvements made after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014? Well, a simple answer would be that all Ukrainian presidents lose elections. Only one has ever won re-election, which was Leonid Kuchma in 1999. And he used political technology, basically cheated. But Poroshenko tried to buck that trend, not by stressing the kind of handbook, sort of pocketbook achievements, the kind of bread and butter delivery of public services that he had actually presided over considerable improvements on. He tried to depict his opponent as a national and an opponent of everything cultural that had been achieved in Ukraine since 1991. Poroshenko only won 25% of the vote. Zelensky more than 70%. So many people interpreted this as a new minority faith. That Ukrainian nationalism had gone back to this position where it could only command literally again 25% of the vote. But this was fundamentally to misunderstand Zelensky and what he was about. Here's one better initial judgment by the philosopher Volodymyr Zelensky about the philosopher Volodymyr Yarmolenko, writing about Zelensky in 2019. Quote, Zelensky is a hybrid candidate who symbolises many interesting trends in eastern and southern Ukraine. He is a mirror of people living in these regions who may have had, at one time, pro-Russian or pro-Soviet views. But after Russian aggression, they no longer have illusions about Moscow. At the same time, they cannot yet fully identify with the Ukrainian cultural project. They identify with Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma's slogan, Ukraine is not Russia, famous ghost-written book, but they do not know exactly what Ukraine is. In this sense, Zelensky is part of a post-colonial society slowly moving from its post-Soviet identity to something more modern and Western. To paraphrase, Yarmolenko explains Zelensky's victory because Zelensky was one of us. He was one of these amorphous voters who had bought into some parts of the Ukrainian project by 2019, but not all. And here I will cite an excellent book that came out last year by Oliver Lunch and Henry Hay called The Zelensky Effect, which makes the extremely important argument that Zelensky was, first of all, in his campaign for the presidency, and then in his, if you like, pre-war presidency, 2019 to 2022, he was converting all of these somewhat amorphous, partly Ukrainian voters to a stronger sense of civic Ukrainian national identity. Hugely important because these are the people that Russia sought to target and hoped would switch sides in 2022. Too late. They had already converted to the Ukrainian court, and more about that in a minute. Onuch and Hale talk about a surge in attachment to the state. Pride in Ukrainian citizenship went up from 2019 to 59% in 2020 and 82% in July 2022. Even before war, or renewed war, in 2022, Zelensky was building on this sense of a more civic state capable of delivering for its citizens compared to the post-Soviet paradigm of corruption. Public works, although much mocked, particularly road building, was enormously popular. The DIA app, which is technically highly advanced and way better than many equivalents in Western countries, was both an extremely effective way of dealing with corruption in public services. Computers don't take bribes. You can basically get whatever you want online now. But also vastly increased this sense that the state was delivering now for its citizens without corrupt intermediaries. Even during coronavirus, when Ukraine was extremely badly hit and totally unable to provide the kind of furlough program that existed in the UK and elsewhere, opinion polls showed a rising sense that the state was actually delivering for its citizens, or at least doing its best to deliver for its citizens. Finally, war. There's huge literature in nationalism and studies on war and national identity. Politics and the politics of war can trump each other, but in the Ukrainian case, they have clearly complemented each other in recent years. War has been hugely important in consolidating Ukrainian identity and its ideational basis. Partly in Charles Tilley's sense of a state-led consolidation since 2014 of territory, of a fighting population, and the resources to acquire the means of war. But more bottom-up than top-down. Here I'll quote Ernest, Anthony Smith, and John Hutchinson. Ernest said, "A people shares a glorious heritage as well, regrets and a common program to realise. Having suffered, rejoiced, and hoped together is worth more than common taxes or frontiers that conform to strategic interests and is independent of racial and linguistic considerations. Suffering, rejoicing, and hoping together creates common identity." Anthony Smith. The war experience may unite previously disparate groups and differentiate them from threatening others. The salience of key national myths increases or is even sacralized by war. War creates harder boundaries between us and them, friends and enemies. The threat of death and conquest can force populations to confront fundamental questions about their identity and purpose. Finally, John Hutchinson. The constitutive myths of many nations are derived from war experience. So in Ukraine, you see various types of, crudely, broadly, social construction under the traumatic pressure of war. And I'll show a lot of data to illustrate this shortly. Five types. Firstly, belated Soviet rejectionism. If Ukraine was post-Soviet in the 1990s, it is now very different to Russia in terms of its attitude towards the Soviet past. In Russia, nostalgia for that past has actually increased in recent years. In Ukraine, the trend is very much in the opposite direction. Second, Russia as Ukraine's constitutive other. This is in many ways ahistorical. Poland used to be Ukraine's most important constitutive other. Then the Crimean Tatars. Now they are both political allies. The Crimean Tatars, in fact, are part of a double civic nation. Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars are both civic nations in themselves, but collectively they form a double-linked civil Ukrainian nation. Related to that, attempts to redefine Russia as nothing but its politics. Here, language and terminology, hugely important, and you can see an awful lot of effort going into this. In modern terms, Russia is Mordor, it's imperial, it's Moscovia, often written in lowercase, meaning just the lands around Moscow, rather than this idea of a state with as a global pole of influence. The old-fashioned term Zalicia has come back into favour. That means beyond the forest. Kiev is the central core of East Slavic civilization. Russia developed somewhere historically in the forests, a long way away from Europe and centres of culture. Russia is the horde. It's autocratic. It is a society of crime without punishment, to paraphrase Dostoevsky. It's Asiopa. So it's not, it's often called Eurasia. Neither Europe nor Eurasia, neither Europe nor Asia, an amalgam of both. But in that English hybrid, Europe comes before Asia. Whereas Asiopa in Slavic means Asia first and Europa second. So Eurasian Russia is actually more Asian than it's Eurasian. Rude death, which, trust me, works in Ukrainian. Russia as anti-civilization. And even clearly chosen social construction. Two examples from the last 6 months. The decision to shift the date of Christmas. Traditionally that is on the 7th of January in the old calendar. But the Greek Catholic Church, and now the Orthodox Church of Ukraine will probably follow, has shifted Christmas to the 25th of December for no other reason whatsoever than to differentiate Ukrainian and Russian culture. There is even talk of shifting to the Latin alphabet for the Ukrainian language. Again, to differentiate it from Cyrillic alphabet as used for Russia. Thirdly, the idea of one struggle. That the current war is a continuation of permanent war between Ukraine and Russia. I'll put some data on that up in a minute. Fourthly, disappearing Russians. According to the last Soviet census, there were just over 11 million Russians in Ukraine. Many, therefore, talked of the Russian minority at the time as the largest national minority in Europe, although, to repeat, it wasn't really a single community. Now, the number of Russians, because of re-identification, data to come, is 2.2 million. Only about 1 million of that is due to outmigration. So, 11 million in 1989, 2 or 3 million today. That means Putin, who launched this war to save Russians or protect Russians, has basically lost 8 or 9 million Russians in Ukraine. Fifthly, the idea of freedom. Now, that's often called svoboda in Ukrainian, which means the general political condition of freedom. But it's also volia, which means freedom as will or willpower, the will to survive. Freedom as self-defense against aggression. Freedom as living in truth against Russian propaganda and lies. And finally, the equation of Europe and freedom. Ukraine is European because Europe values freedom and Russia does not. So I'd like to finish with the data that I promised to illustrate all of this. Before I do, Gerard Tull has sounded a sceptical note about opinion polling in wartime. Quite right. So have Henry Yale and others on polling in Russia. In Russia, people talk about what Henry Hale calls authoritarian rallying, partly because of fear of an authoritarian state. There are also problems of Potemkin polling. Opinion pollsters ask questions designed to solicit the kind of evidence that they think the leadership in the Kremlin wants to hear. There's a whole literature on problems of polling in Russia. Now, some of those problems also exist in Ukraine, but not the fear of the Kremlin. But Gerard Tull has talked about patriotic performance and social desirability. People say what they think is the right thing, particularly at a time of war. Just to quote 2 examples. 93%, according to recent polls in Ukraine, see a promising future for their country. Now, that can't be an economic statement, it can't be a social statement. It must be a general existential statement. We will win, and 98% of Ukrainians expect to win in the war. Again, which has to be a combination of we will and we should. 73% believe the country is heading in the right direction, which again makes no sense economically, or socially, or demographically. It's basically an existential statement, a kind of collective statement that Ukraine is doing the right thing while fighting. So there are huge caveats on some of these data. Ernest and Hale, in their book, The Zelensky Effect, conducted a list experiment to try and probe some of this. Basically, I won't go into the technical details, but by using this method, they calculated that there was a difference between the 88% who said in a general question that they supported Zelensky and his policies, was more like 60. So there was a kind of 28% who were engaged in this patriotic performance, saying what they thought the pollsters wanted people to say. But with that in mind, finally, some evidence about how, firstly, Ukraine was already changing as a society before the war, and secondly, how much it is changing as a society during the war today. And this first diagram is taken straight from Onunch and Hay, so all credit to them. So, two vertical lines show March, April 2019, when Zelensky is elected, and then February 22, the second vertical line, the start of the current war. So right at the top, how many people classify themselves as Ukrainian? That's going up and up to 94% then. So look at the general trend upwards, but also the kind of upticks in an upward trend. Firstly with Zelensky's election, and then secondly with Russian invasion. Second dotted line is how many Ukrainians want to join NATO. Their willingness to protest. The black line is the belief that democracy is the best form of government. More about that in a minute. Civic Ukraine. How many people have donated funds, volunteered in the community since the Russian invasion? Huge numbers. Another aspect of civic identity, slightly small text, so I'll read it out. First graph. It's important to vote in every election, going up from 81% to 98%. Second graph. It's important to engage in political and or civil society activities, going up from 50 to 62%. I would be neglecting my duty if I didn't protest if the situation in Ukraine requires it. So willingness to protest, high at 43%, going up to 47%. This is a bigger version of that graph showing the idea that support for democracy is the best form of government for Ukraine. Used to be only 41% back in 2019. Now it's more like 76. Little dip from May to July last year to 71%. But huge numbers believing that democracy is good for Ukraine and good for people like us in Ukraine. Are you involved in volunteer activities to help Ukrainian defense forces and internally displaced persons? Huge numbers basically saying yes, both personally and financially. This one is in Ukrainian. I'll translate for you. Trust me. So the question is, what is your nationality? So the last proper census in Ukraine was back in 2001. 78% said they were Ukrainian, 17% said they were Russian, 5% said they were other. So going through the years, all the way up to April 2022. 92% say they are Ukrainian, only 5% say they are Russian, 3% other nationalities. So these are millions of Russians that Putin has lost. Because people, particularly from mixed families, identify more as Ukrainian than as Russian. What do you consider yourself first and foremost? Bottom line, citizen of the USSR, Soviet identity. So that used to be quite strong, 12% in year 2000, only 3% today. Middle line, resident of my village, city, or region. Top line, citizen of Ukraine. So, back in 2000, roughly equal numbers identified with a locality as compared to national citizenship. So these regional identities have receded and national citizenship is now primary identity. Do you now regret the collapse of the USSR in 1991? On the left, Russians, on the right, Ukrainians. So starting in 2010, before recent revolutions, Ukraine and Russia were in roughly similar position. In Russia, on the left, regretting the collapse of the Soviet Union, numbers in blue have actually gone up to 2021. Whereas in Ukraine, from a similar starting point, huge collapse in nostalgia. And notice how it accelerates in recent years. Attitude to World War II. Should May the 9th be celebrated as Victory Day, a Soviet tradition, and Putin has put an enormous amount of state money and propaganda into promoting this idea. So in 2012, most Ukrainians agree, yeah, it was Victory Day, 74%. But now only 15%, and again note how dramatically that shift has occurred in recent years. So a shift to the kind of supposedly European position that you remember the end of the war as a day of remembrance of war victims, rather than this kind of uber-patriotic Victory Day. What is your attitude towards the following historical figures? Bogdan Khmelnytsky was a Cossack leader, Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, a historian, and head of the Ukrainian People's Republic in 1917. They've always been quite popular. Blue, dark blue and light blue, positive. But other people, Ivan Mazepa, who fought against Peter the Great, Stepan Bandera, nationalist leader, Simeon Petlura, whose followers, who was also one of the heads of the Ukrainian People's Republic, but whose followers committed pogroms in 1920-21. These used to be much more controversial things, but now general approval is extended to them too, because they are seen as fighters in the same cause. This is in Ukrainian, but do you support the recognition of the OUN-UPA as fighters for the state independence of Ukraine? So this was kind of nationalist guerrilla army in the 1940s. So going back to 2010, you have quite a lot of red, negative attitudes. Not much blue. So a big change to seeing these previously controversial figures as also positive. You can see those blue numbers growing. This is Lenin and Stalin. Stalin on the left, Lenin on the right. Big falls in their popularity, which is a huge difference to Russia. This is Ukrainian, all of it, so I'll have to explain it. How do you stand to these wars? What is your attitude to the following wars? On the left, the war of the Soviet army with fascism. In the middle, the war of the contemporary Ukrainian army. On the right, the war of the UPA, the army in the 1940s. So blue is positive. So if you look at the one in the middle, of course, the current war of the Ukrainian army is viewed extremely positively. So, on the whole, still, is war of the Soviet army in the 1940s. So, also, and this is a recent change, the UPA in the 40s. Anybody who fought for Ukraine is now seen as heroic. So this shows the rising popularity of Simon Petlura and Stefan Bandera, these previously controversial figures. Do you support the banning of the St. George's emblem in Ukraine? This is the kind of orange and black symbol that the Kremlin has propagandized. It used to be a kind of war symbol. It's now the kind of used as the kind of symbol for Russian victory in the current war. So most Ukrainians, getting much higher numbers, would agree to ban the symbol, up to 74%. First figure, do you recognise acts of the Russian army in Ukraine as genocide? 92% in Ukraine. 78% for banning this St. George's symbol, and 77% would ban the symbols of Z and V. A consolidated national identity means that the answer to the question, should Ukraine compromise in order to achieve peace and preserve its independence and give up some of its territories? 8%, that's the orange bar at the top. Going down during the war, albeit only from 10 to 8%. 87% do not want any territorial compromise. Attitudes towards others. Let's take the second one. Residents of Russia. Used to be, even back in 2018, fairly warm, 47%, neutral, 30%, only 23% hostile. So you see 69% hostility now, even towards ordinary Russians, residents of Russia. This line shows positive or negative attitudes towards Russia. Good, blue, bad, orange. So before the war, Ukrainians had 90% to 10% good rather than bad opinion of Russians. See how dramatically that changes, first in 2014, and then some improvement, limited improvement in recent years, but then again in 2022 becoming negative again. And what is Russia? It is seen as dictatorship, fascism, Nazism even, are the most common words used to describe it. Again, this is Ukrainian. So which term best characterises the contemporary political regime in Russia is the question. And the list is dictatorship, 41%, fascism, 37%, Nazism, 10%, monarchy, democracy, anarchy, other. Hard to say. So you get a hardening of us and them. And interestingly, not just Putin, not just the Russian political system, but negative opinions of Russians in general. Extremely negative opinions about the Russian political system. So to conclude, we often think of nation building as a 19th century phenomenon. It's happening in Ukraine right now. Not ex nihilo. Ukraine was already a nation, albeit an amorphous one, already at the time of independence in 1991. But it's changed enormously in 32 years, and the pace of change is accelerating as we speak. There is a new cliche, even, about Putin, the great Ukrainian nation builder. This is true to some extent, but also not ex nihilo, not out of nothing. Putin has pushed more Ukrainians to join trends that were already happening and were already cumulative before 2022. But under the pressure of war, you can see a clear acceleration of these trends. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I took slightly more than 45 minutes, but we still have time.
So, well, thank you very much.
We do have some time for some questions, if there are some questions for Professor Wilson, prior to the reception, which will be starting in, at 6 o'clock, just outside. So I can open the floor now to questions.
You mentioned political technology. I'd love to know more about that. You also mentioned Charles Tilley, so I'm immediately wondering if that's repertoires of contention, or is that something completely different? But what's going on with this idea of political technologies that you mentioned?
Right. Well, we don't use the term. In Russia and in Ukraine, unfortunately, you hear it all the time. I asked Russians to define it. And I also read plenty of online Russian definitions. Not very helpful. They say all politics is technology. All politics is manipulation. And you think, okay, no it isn't. But that tells you a lot about Russians. Right? The idea that politics is just the engineering of political systems. In the 90s, before this became basically a Kremlin monopoly, it was a business, much like political consulting is in the West. And one of the companies in Russia was called Nikola M. Machiavelli. It had a little picture of Machiavelli on its website, business card. So that's what they were selling. Victory by Machiavelli means, though Machiavelli wasn't that Machiavelli. So in Russia, it's this idea that all politics is manipulation, a technical art, and that anything is justifiable because that's all politics is. We're the same, but we dress things up behind all sorts of facades. So the phrase is ubiquitous because Russians don't really believe in democracy, they believe in manipulation of politics. So my definition is the supply side manipulation of political systems for partisan advantage. So it's not something that people vote for, it's something that elites do, the supply side. And it's deleterious for democracy because it's for partisan advantage. You could imagine sometimes in political engineering which might be a good thing. Like in the last Russian parliamentary elections, Alexei Navalny tried to get his supporters to vote for the least bad party that was on offer. There wasn't a complete freedom of choice because the Kremlin pre-selected who could stand, classic political technology. So you have to have that phrase at the end for partisan advantage, because this was Navalny kind of trying to engineer the political system for what he saw as a positive. So in the West, we talk about spin or political consulting. And often that phrase is way outdated. Because a lot of people who call themselves spin doctors are also engineering the political system, rather than just affecting how politics is reported, spin, or importing business techniques and money into political systems, which is political consulting. Like in America, you get all these astroturf businesses who will sell you anything. How many of you know what astroturfing is here in sports? It means creating a fake grassroots movement. Instead of playing sport on the grass, you play it on fake grass. And astroturfing is faking public initiative. So that's, on my definition, that's political consulting. Political technology. Because you're engineering, you're creating something artificial. So what used to be a wholly Russian thing, you can see happening in the West too. Propaganda. Now, unfortunately, there was actually quite a lot of this in Ukraine. Though it peaked in 2014, and then has become more difficult. The Russians who kind of used to come to Ukraine and organise this kind of thing aren't popular anymore. That's one reason. But another is public expectation. Zelensky gave a speech the other day, his annual address. He said, "No one at the front line will understand if at the end of the war we go back to the old ways of doing it. So we have to clean up our act post-war." Ukraine was actually doubly unlucky because it was an object of Russian political manipulation. But its own politics was also sort of domestically corrupt as well. So it had that problem. But there are some grounds for optimism post-war. Zelensky is personally liberated by his own popularity. The oligarchs who used to be powerful in Ukraine are much less powerful now because they've got so much money in the war. But they've also lost some of their media. So political technology is a phrase that's used a lot in Eastern Europe. If you define it properly, you can see that it happens in other countries too. But in Russia, it's ubiquitous. Everything is created and propagandized by these methods.
I wonder if I could perhaps use my position as chair here and ask a question myself, because I'm thinking, I was listening to, I'm thinking in terms of thinking as an ASEN, person coming out of this, intellectual milieu, what can we learn about nationalism in general from this? And I was thinking specifically of your description of the Zelensky effect, and that captured my attention, that there was this misunderstanding, and perhaps there shouldn't have been, perhaps we should have seen this coming more, by the fact that, as you said, the true independence movement up to, could really only ever garner approximately, 25%, and people really misunderstood Zelensky's success as being, at first, as being a repudiation of that. So am I correct in sort of interpreting what you interpreting what you were saying in terms of Zelensky's success as being, people
are less likely, to follow a movement of true believers or a leader who is a true believer, because people, most of us really are, in fact, ambivalent, ambiguous by nature, and therefore our nationalism is as well a lot more ambiguous and ambivalent. We are more likely to follow we're less likely to follow somebody who is a true believer than somebody or a movement that tells us you don't have to be in order to be part of this community. And I'm wondering, first of all, is that a sort of a correct reading of how of your interpretation of the current phase of Ukrainian nationalism? And also, is this something that you think is particular to the history of Ukraine, or is this something that we can learn more about nationalism in general from in this moment? So that's...
Yeah, great question. Well, in terms of theories of nationalism, war is hugely important as an accelerator of things that are already happening. You don't get 180 returns, although wars can destroy nations, particularly nations that lose wars. So if you think about Weber's book, Peasants into Frenchmen, it's about the Third Republic, 1817 to 1940. Right? So you've got the First World War in the middle. So in 1914, you could still get Breton peasants being shot for treason, because basically they didn't understand what their officers were saying. So the First World War in France acted as the great accelerator of everything that Weber was talking about. Processes that were already existing got this massive kick in the same direction. The importance of politics and the politics of war, and the importance of ideas, ideas that can be dormant if they find the right expression of those ideas, suddenly become more powerful. And that, I think, is Zelensky, because he takes these quite intellectual ideas, freedom, volia, but expresses them in a fantastically demotic way. And his whole wartime persona, there's another debate about whether this is a new Zelensky or just Zelensky's retooling the skills that he already had, which suddenly became more valuable in wartime. But presentationally, he's this anti-Putin. There was a phrase in his inaugural lecture which sounded a bit like PR at the time. Any of you can be president, just like that. So it's kind of demotic appeal. I'm ordinary, you're ordinary, we mirror each other. It sounded a bit PR, but Putin would never say that. Right? Putin is, I am special, because I'm president. He has this hauteur, and so on. So Zelensky, I think, is brilliant at coming out of an ordinary milieu and expressing things in ordinary terms, and using ordinary props. So the visuals of his selfie videos are hugely important. There was this moment in October which I think symbolised everything. He gave us a series of selfie videos in ordinary places in Kiev. Park opposite the university where people play with their kids and play chess and drink beer. And he was basically saying, after the war we'll be back. This is the life that we love, and we'll get back to it. And then the next day, Putin bombed some of these places, right? Basically to say, no, you're not. But that doesn't change the power of his original appeal. Not all war presidents are like that. So Churchill wasn't like that at all. So Churchill's rhetoric was very elegant, elevated, whether he deserved the Nobel Prize for Literature or not, is another question. But you know, he was crafting a much more literary style, and if you look at the words that Zelensky used in his speech to Parliament, there's this really clever echoing of Churchill as an appeal to us, British audience. So he basically starts, "We will fight them on the..." But he doesn't say beaches. He basically says, "We'll fight them on the slag heaps. We'll fight them on the industrial estate." So it's kind of Ukrainianising it in a way that's recognisable to a British audience, but appeal to a Ukrainian audience as well. He's young, he's social media savvy, that obviously helps hugely. But he's very good at appealing to all audiences as well. So not all war leaders are like that, but I think he is an extremely effective one.
We have time for some more questions.
Couple more.
Yeah, building on that, I mean, I sort of first found out about Zelensky when there was all these stories about the guy who played history teacher who accidentally became president, has now actually become president. And then sort of after the war kicked off and he got a lot of attention, a lot of his old sort of comedy sketches came to the fore as well, which wasn't quite funny. But I was wondering, like, how does this work with him being seen as him having this sort of extra image as a comedian or former comedian, him obviously being like quite a funny person? How does the sort of combination of that sort of war hero, sort of war leader image and comedian image, how does that play in Ukraine?
Well, Zelensky isn't just a comedian. It's more like a national personality becoming president. Don't know what the equivalent would be in the UK.
I suppose Churchill's quite funny and is remembered for being quite funny, but more as an amateur.
Yeah, well, you know, wit, apostle or whatever. Not quite the same way. Lenny Henry is president. Not good analogy.
Dame Edna.
President Edna of Australia. Because he was a comedian, but also he won the Ukrainian version of Strictly Come Dancing, Dancing with the Stars. He did the voice of Paddington. He's a successful businessman. So a lot of his own comedy, he was quite demotic. There's a lot of sexual jokes. He gave this interview when he said, because okay, you're a comedian. Who's your favourite comedian? And he said, well, Monty Python are okay, but my favourite is basically Benny Hill. So 1970s, crude, pretty sexist stuff. He was popular in the sense that he would make fun out of everything without exclusion. So a lot of Ukrainian nationalists picked on the kind of anti-Ukrainian jokes that he's made in the past, and he's made a lot. He used to perform in Russia. He would sort of join in with Russian stereotyping about. A lot of countries have their equivalent of Irish jokes, when you kick down at people who are supposedly less cultured or whatever. And that's how Russians tell jokes about Ukrainians. And often Zelensky would have jokes like that. Ukrainians are stupid, or whatever. And often in isolation that looks bad. But his self-defense is that, you know, I make a joke out of anything. But he and a kind of former aide of his, a guy called Alexei Arestovich, people often view them in isolation and say, oh, God, these guys sound like, you know, they echo some of the themes and tropes of Russian propaganda. What's going on? What they're doing is trying to appeal to these other audiences that Putin was targeting. That's why they use that kind of language. It's trying to shift them into the Ukrainian camp, is the argument. But I think Zelensky has changed a lot by the war. So one of his famous, this is typically him, in the debate about 2015, Ukraine passed something called decommunization laws. So cities, towns, streets with names from the Soviet Union should have the name changed. So no more Lenin Square or Lenin Street should be named after Ukrainian cultural figures or whatever. So Zelensky famously said, "Who cares what the streets called as long as the street lights work?" But you wouldn't imagine him saying that now. But I think he's changed by war leadership. And when during that war people want to kill you and your family, and have come quite close, you know, that changes people. There is a backstory here. There are huge numbers of mixed marriages in Ukraine. So there's a big pool of people available to make an either-or choice. That's not the only reason. But it's interesting that people have shifted identity and identification with citizenship much more quickly than they've shifted language use. Some people are generally bilingual, but that's actually quite rare, even in a double language society. So it actually takes quite a long time to shift patterns of language use. You have to learn the other language. But there was also this kind of Soviet tradition of ethnicity as this kind of this fixed but plastic thing that you could, because the whole point of Soviet ethnic policy was to emphasize plasticity, national in form but socialist in content. You were labelled as a Ukrainian or a Russian or a Tajik or whatever. That didn't really matter because you were becoming Soviet. So I think there's also an element of that in a post-Soviet context, people may change nationality label more readily than in other contexts. But it's certainly related to this now negative idea of Russia. which is actually pretty simple. Russia attacked us for no good reason. And Russia says that we don't exist. And Russian TV is full of this hyperbolic, crazy biliousness about how vile and disgusting Ukrainians are, day after day after day. So why would you associate with that? You associate with the antonyms, the opposite. That helps.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Very interesting lecture. There is a reception. We say anything more about that? Or there is a reception directly outside, and we can move the conversation and continue the conversation over liqueurs and drinks. Thank you very much. Cameras there.
So I definitely took more than my.
No, that was really interesting.
That was the kind of cue